Thank you for joining our National Dairy Month expert session. Today's session will concentrate on dairy myth busting, science and trusting from farm to recovery fuel. I'm Katie Knappenberger and I'll play the role of moderator. Now I would like to introduce our panelists, Matt Pekoski, Leslie Bonsi, and Abby Copenhaver. Matt is the Vice President of Nutrition Research for the National Dairy Council and is a registered dietitian. He has over 15 years of nutrition research and scientific communications experience across government, nonprofit, food, and beverage industry. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in nutrition and a master's degree in exercise physiology and a PhD in nutrition, all from the University of Connecticut, where his research focused on defining optimal protein intakes for endurance athletes and physically active adults. In his current role, Matt leads the Dairy Protein Research Group, the goal of which is to build scientific evidence supporting unique consumer-focused benefits of milk and dairy protein ingredients to strengthen marketplace positioning and catalyze industry innovation. Leslie is the owner of Active Eating Advice by Leslie, a nutrition consulting company and co-founder of Performance 365, a sports nutrition consulting company. Leslie was a spokesperson for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and is a sought-after industry spokesperson. She conducts media training, lectures, and writes on topics such as communicating with conviction, science sensationalism, and performance nutrition. Her clients include the National Dairy Council, General Mills, The Wonderful Company, Gatorade, Clean Athlete, Monsanto, Potatoes USA, the California Prune Board, and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And finally, Abby is a registered dietitian nutritionist and has an 800-cow dairy farm in Stanley, New York. She started in 2013 with her husband and two other couples, farming 1,500 acres. In 2014, Abby started Farmstead Nutrition and Consulting, focusing on agriculture production, food technology, nutrition, and fitness-related services. Her academic background includes a bachelor's from Cornell University in animal science, a bachelor's from Buffalo State College in human nutrition and dietetics, and a master's in agriculture, food science, and management from Washington State University. As a registered dietitian nutritionist, she practices with a farming, food, and fitness approach. This approach encompasses the connection between agriculture, food production, nutrition, and physical activity to promote a healthy and sustainable lifestyle. Thanks to our partners from the National Dairy Council, I'd like to briefly turn it over to Allison Koch, Director of Health and Wellness Partnership for the National Dairy Council, for a few comments from NDC.
Thanks, Katie. So National Dairy Council is excited to again sponsor the expert sessions in 2019 as part of our ongoing partnership with CPSDA. And for those of you who may not be familiar with who we are or what we do, National Dairy Council was founded in 1915. It's a nonprofit organization funded by the 35,000 plus dairy farm families across the U.S. And our diverse team of scientists like Matt, dietitians, and communications professionals work with colleagues in academia, government, and the industry to develop and fund research. And once that science is published, we translate it and package it up for a variety of stakeholders, including scientists, health professionals like yourselves, and the general public. So in the last month, I bet many of you have had questions from your athletes or clients about how a food is grown or made, about animal care, how food systems or personal food choices impact the environment. And if I asked you if the same was true 10 or 15 years ago, you might not say the same. Probably not. The world in which we live is changing, and we know from research and insights that people are in fact becoming more interested in food and have a passion for food and are more conscientious of what goes in their bodies, especially our athletes. More consumers are questioning where their food comes from, how it was raised, grown, or produced, and what its impact is on the environment. They still want to enjoy it with as little prep as possible. So you're on the front lines with your athletes. You're faced daily with answering some difficult questions. And so today, we really want to make sure you're equipped and prepared to answer those questions, especially as it relates to dairy. So that's why we've brought you a farmer, a researcher, and a leading sports RD to address some of the top questions you have. I first want to thank you for participating in the pre-session survey. We received a lot of great questions and are going to do our best to answer them today. And I've included some links in the handout to helpful blog posts on nationaldairycouncil.org and dairygood.org that can help fully answer some of the questions we might not get to today. I've also included on the handout some links to helpful educational tools, resources, which I'll highlight before we close. And we'll also leave time for any additional questions that may be sparked by our conversation today. But before I turn things over to our experts, I really wanted to first address a topic that may or may not be top of mind for you, but we did receive a couple questions on before we get started. Over the last few months, in the course of my career, I've been fortunate enough to meet with numerous farmers as well as tour their dairy farms, both large and small. What always strikes me is the amount of care, concern, and attention that the farmers give to the animals, whether a farm has 13,000 cows or 200 cows. I'll definitely let Abby speak to this further, but before I do, I want to assure you that U.S. dairy community is deeply disappointed and saddened by the actions shown in recent undercover activist videos from Fair Oaks Farms. Simply put, animal abuse in any form is not tolerated on U.S. dairy farms. Dairy farmers have a strong, well-documented commitment to animal welfare, a priority every day for producers nationwide. More than 95% of nation's nearly 37,000 dairy farms are family-owned and operated. Dairy farmers have a strong legacy of caring for their animals, and in fact, 98% of the U.S. milk supply is represented through the National Dairy Farmers Assuring Responsible Management, or FARM, animal care program that sets animal care standards for all participating farms. The FARM program is the first livestock animal care program in the world to be recognized by the International Organization for Standardization Animal Welfare Management Standards. It's important to recognize that in this situation, as soon as mistreatment was discovered and long before knowledge of the videos existed, Fair Oaks Farms immediately fired 3 employees. The farm also is cooperating with investigators and implementing a set of commitments announced earlier this month to prevent this from happening again. I'd encourage you to visit Fair Oaks Farms and Fairlife's websites, which speak to the commitments and actions each are putting into place to address the unfortunate situation that happened. And I'm happy to post those links to those on the listserv following today's expert session, if that would be helpful. You and your athletes can continue to enjoy consuming milk and other dairy products, knowing they are produced by farmers who deeply care about animal care, and as a community, we are committed to continuous improvement. Hearing from me is one thing, but hearing from a farmer who works with and cares for cows on a daily basis firsthand is much more impactful. So with that, I think we should turn the Q&A over to Abby. All right, Abby. So, since we're on the topic of animal care, why don't we start there? Can you speak to how animals are treated on farm and how consumers can know which farms are treating them appropriately? And then can you also touch on what the standards are for humane treatment of animals?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. Anytime people send me an invitation to talk about my cows, I get super excited. So thank you. This is definitely something that we think about on a daily basis. The first thing I always like to tell people is that when it comes to cow care and energy needs, if you want to compare our cows to kind of being like our athletes, when it comes to energy use, milk production kind of comes last. So with us, if we can make sure that all of our cows' nutritional needs are met and that there's not stress from coming from any other area of their life and routine, then we can make sure that they're going to be the best cow athletes that they can be. So that's definitely something that we focus on because if our cows aren't content and their needs are not being met, that milk production is not going to occur the way it needs to, which is how dairy farmers actually make money and stay in business. In addition to the fact that our cows actually have to reach about 2 years of age in order to actually start producing milk, and many of our cows don't actually reach full maturity until about 3 years, so that's when they're reaching about peak milk production. So we're pouring a lot of financial and emotional investment into our cows before we even see a return. So financially and emotionally, our commitment and investment in our cows is very high risk before we even see any return on our animals. I'm really glad that Allison brought up the farm program because that's kind of the best way I can summarize that commitment we have as an industry in the United States as a whole and where a lot of our standards come from. So with the farm program, the farmers assuring responsible management of their animals. So it's our I love puns, so I love that that the farm worked out for such a great acronym. But I really like to emphasize that it's not just about animal stewardship. That program talks about environmental stewardship, antibiotic stewardship, and even employee management. And because farmers do believe so strongly in that if we take care of our cows first, they will take care of us, that if we have a unified standard throughout the industry to operate off of, that not only do we have the ability to monitor and then turn around and improve our farms even further, but then we can also help farmers regulate the employees that they're bringing in on their farm, implement best practices for animal care. And a lot of that is because we have a third party, the Innovation Center, being able to work with researchers to incorporate that research and best handling practices into those farm program regulations. So it's really constantly looking at all those things. And just a few examples of the things we look at on farm to make sure that our ladies stay comfortable. We're talking about ventilation systems, so airflow, temperature, air quality, air volume, light exposure, manure composition. When I got into dietetics, I loved it because when my clinical supervisor said, you can learn a lot about a person by their bowel movements, I was like, this is perfect. Because the first thing my dad taught me about doing a health check on a cow is to look at her manure and how often she's going, the composition, how it is for her. So it's really comparable. Her bunk space, cooling, bug control. She even gets her hooves trimmed, and she gets her little pedicures. And then we have a pretty rigorous vaccine protocol for our animals as well to make sure they stay healthy. And all those are monitored by SOPs that are implemented, working with our vet through the farm program and with each farmer individually on the farm.
That's great. Sounds like you're really putting the comfort of the cow at the top of your priority list. So what happens then? A cow gets sick. We hear a lot about antibiotics. Can you speak to how antibiotic use is managed on the farm?
Yes, so I actually do. This is one of probably the most common questions I get when farmers, actually the first thing they're like is, do you take selfies with your cows a lot? And then the second question is usually about antibiotic stewardship. So I always love to start off by telling people that it does not matter what dairy product you go to the store to buy, yogurt, cheese, milk, what brand, you will not find antibiotics in those products. And the way I can confidently say that as a dairy farmer and as a dietitian is because we have a lot of programs that we work with, such as the farm program and the FDA, along with our veterinarians that work with us on the farms, to have regulations in place to make sure that doesn't happen. Because one, we want to ensure high quality milk, and two, it is actually illegal to have any milk enter the chain for human consumption if there is antibiotics present. So the big thing that we do on farm is that we work with veterinarians that establish SOPs for us that include regulations by the FDA that include milk withholding times. So if we have a lady that unfortunately catches a respiratory bug or mastitis, unfortunately, we try to keep our ladies as comfortable as possible, but it does happen. She has a certain amount of time where her milk has to be discarded. So she is physically separated from her herd mates. So she's put in an area where we can provide that extra care that she needs, that individual care that she needs, as well as it helps us follow those guidelines and SOPs that the FDA and our vet help us work with. So she also has to have certain testing she goes through before her milk can go back into saleable milk and with her herd mates that's shipped off the farm and then take to a processing plant. And then in addition to that, our farm also makes sure that we physically identify her. So if for some reason she wants to get back to her herd mates and she makes an escape, if she comes in the parlor, we immediately know that she needs to be separated from her herd mates. And then also our farmers actually operate electronic medical records per se. So we also have records of when she's been treated, how long that we have to wait before we can start testing her milk to make sure that there's no antibiotics in there. And then we also have that for records so that as we go on, we can kind of look back through her file and see how she's doing. On the farm, we test every single milking of milk. So if we milk 3 times a day and it's all in one tank, that's 3 separate times we're testing the milk. as farmers, and we have to actually get a permit to be able to do that. We have to be certified, and a lot of times we get audited to make sure that we're still doing it appropriately. And then in addition to that, our milk truck drivers take a sample from each load, and it has to come back cleared of antibiotics before it even gets off the truck at the processing plant to be able to be used for whichever dairy product. If for some reason something does happen where antibiotic makes it into that load, there's a very, very heavy repercussion for that, because you don't get paid for your milk. You have to pay for the other farmer's milk that is on board with your milk that was taken to the plant. And then you also have to pay for the discarding process of that milk. And then you have to work with the FDA on a plan of action of correction to make sure that doesn't happen again, in addition to making sure that
Looks like Abby may have frozen. So if we have a chance, hopefully she can call back in. I might switch over to Matt. Matt, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. I just had myself on mute, so.
No worries. Hopefully we can get Abby back unfrozen. But while we wait for her to come back, I will switch over to some research questions that we've received, and we'll play it by ear here. So, so Matt, some of the questions we get a lot. I know I've received them, you have as well, and it's a topic very top of mind for athletes is related to inflammation. So Matt, can you address the current state of the science surrounding dairy and inflammation? Is there any evidence behind the belief that dairy is actually inflammatory?
Sure. Yes, common question, certainly, whether it's working with athletes or even the general public, right? People are now kind of aware and looking through what are various anti-inflammatory foods or diets. So certainly is an area, that we and other scientists have been investigating. I think when addressing this or talking about this topic, it's important to note that there are differences in inflammation, or really the causes of inflammation, right? And there are some causes like injury, illness, a hard bout of exercise, where acute inflammation actually brings some benefit, right? It helps to speed and promote the recovery process. So in those instances, again, inflammation is a positive thing to, get us, back to where we could perform or no longer be sick, etc. Now, the inflammation that is a concern is kind of what's called, kind of systemic, low-grade chronic inflammation that generally is asymptomatic unless you were looking, in the blood for various inflammatory markers, various cytokines and such. And we know that now, as science has evolved, that specific low-grade chronic inflammation has been associated with various metabolic diseases like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and even obesity. So from that perspective, really there is a growing body of research that shows adequate dairy consumption, certainly as part of a balanced, nutrient-rich diet, is not linked to chronic inflammation, or certainly is not pro-inflammatory. And if anything, there is some evidence to show that it might bring benefits from an anti-inflammatory perspective. A couple pieces of literature I would like to touch on in a bit more detail. There's actually been a review of all the clinical trials that have been done to date. So this review was published in 2017. At that time, these authors reviewed, there were about 52 clinical trials that had been conducted looking at, various dairy foods and encompassing the range of, fat-free to whole-fat dairy foods across milk, cheese, and yogurt, and looking at the impact in both healthy adults and adults with various metabolic disorders, such metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, etc. And overall, what this systematic review concluded is that the body of evidence supports a generally anti-inflammatory benefit of consuming dairy foods. Now, secondary analysis, dove into whether does fat level impact that? Should we be just consuming low-fat or fat-free foods? That was not the case. Basically, dairy of all fat levels had this same benefit in terms of being associated with anti-inflammatory markers, as well as different dairy foods all brought that benefit. So milk, cheese, and yogurt. There was a bit of a stronger benefit showed with fermented dairy foods. So that would be yogurt and cheese. And that kind of leads me to the second point that I wanted to make, is that there's recently been 2 separate clinical trials published out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison last year, I believe. One was a longer-term trial. I think it was somewhere between 9 and 12 weeks, and it gave both normal weight and overweight and obese women. They consumed a serving and a half of just regular low-fat yogurt a day, and in comparison to a control group that had kind of a soy-based pudding. So same kind of general, macronutrient parameters, but certainly, dairy brings a fermented type process that this soy pudding did not. At the end of that trial, there was actually reduced inflammation and improved gut barrier function in those women that consumed the 1.5 servings of yogurt per day. So the interesting thing with gut barrier function is that might be one of the mechanisms by which, in this particular study, fermented dairy or fermented yogurt was having that anti-inflammatory benefit, because as we all know, the gut really acts as a kind of permeable protective barrier to kind of keep the bad stuff out and allow the good stuff in, kind of so to speak, for lack of a better way of saying it. So again, potential enhanced gut permeability might be a reason as to why there was lower inflammation in the groups that consumed the yogurt. The second study, again, also involving yogurt, was kind of a sub-study out of this larger study that showed similar benefits in terms of anti-inflammatory benefit with a single yogurt feed, and that was a yogurt prior to a high-fat containing meal. So they saw reduced inflammation as a result of that meal when yogurt was included or consumed as kind of a pre-meal, so to speak. And they also saw better handling of blood glucose. So again, net results based on all of the data to date is that dairy is either neutral or anti-inflammatory. And from some recent clinical trials that have been published with yogurt, it seems that they support those conclusions and show that maybe gut permeability might be one of the mechanisms by which fermented dairy particularly is having those effects.
Awesome. And I see Abby's back. So Abby, we'll come back to you in a minute, but on the topic of kind of research, and I know it's an area that's really near and dear to your heart, Matt, whey and casein. We know these both come from dairy, and sometimes I think athletes might not realize that the whey powder and casein powder are coming actually from dairy products. But can you speak to why you might choose one over another? What's an appropriate serving size to promote muscle repair and growth, and just a little bit about whey and casein?
Sure. So yeah, to either the individual or groups that brought out that comment, I think, that would be great if just, health professionals, dietitians, and others could just, start with that first piece of education that both whey and casein powders do come from milk. So whey and casein are the 2 predominant proteins in milk. Milk contains about 80% of the protein in milk is casein, 20% is whey. Those are basically derived from milk through 2 processes. One, when cheese is made and special enzymes are added to milk to kind of separate the curds and the whey. That whey stream, or that liquid whey, is then pasteurized and then filtered to varying degrees depending on the concentration of protein that you want. So for example, there are whey powders that are about 34% protein. Whey protein concentrates about 80%, and then isolates are about between 90 and 95%. And really the difference is just the degree of filtration that happens. Casein then would be similar, right? That once that stuff is filtered, it's dried into a powder and then sold. I think there are subtle differences both in the amino acid composition and then the digestibility or rate of digestion with whey and casein that might impact how you might want to use those proteins. Hopefully many of you are aware of the research that, certainly as, measured, over anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, protein synthesis, whether it's at rest or after exercise, and giving different types of proteins, whether it's foods and or protein ingredients. And generally due to its, high leucine content, on proportion of total amino acid content, high total essential amino acids, and high digestibility. That whey in particular is shown to elicit the greatest muscle protein synthesis response when matched on a gram per gram basis, and actually, really kind of be the protein ingredient of choice when you're looking at post-exercise recovery. There's been more research coming out on potential roles of casein, particularly because if it's a longer rate of digestion, a more slower release of those amino acids into the blood following digestion, and then slower availability to the muscle, that might be preferred in two instances. One, when you just know you're going to have, anywhere from 6 to 8 hours in between one meal to the next. Maybe you're having breakfast, but you're not going to be able to have lunch. There might be some value of having at least a portion of your protein coming from casein to have that slower digestibility and then release of the amino acids. Others is, nighttime feedings. Mike Ormsby and others, Luc Van Loon, they've done some work looking at casein in a variety of populations, older populations as well as athletes, prior to bed, is giving a kind of moderate to higher load of casein, anywhere from 20 to 40 grams, if I'm remembering correctly. And they've shown benefits, whether it's, measuring protein synthesis the next morning, and/or I think there's been one study to show over, 9 to 12 weeks of resistance training, preferential response in that group that's provided casein prior to sleep. So that's just kind of an example of how those, different strategies of when you might use those proteins. I would say, generally speaking, in the big picture, from a leucine perspective, most experts will say somewhere between 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine would be recommended, whether it's in a given meal or say that post-exercise protein administration. That would be to help maximize the protein synthesis response. But the other point I want to make there to close out this question is that, yes, while leucine is a critical essential amino acid, and many are aware of it being really that kind of, key initiator of protein synthesis and stimulatory amino acid of protein synthesis, you really need the full composite of essential amino acids for protein synthesis to continue and reach its maximal activity. So while leucine amount in a given food, protein ingredient or meal is important, you want to achieve that 2.5 to 3 grams, but you also want to provide the full complement of essential amino acids. And generally speaking, in young adults where you're looking to maximize that response, I would say somewhere around 10 grams of essential amino acids. In older adults, we know that with age, there's an anabolic resistance that happens. There's been a lot of results looking at protein synthesis response in people in their mid-20s and compared to their 60s and older, that you probably need more essential amino acids. So I would say, again, general figure, say 15 to 20 grams of essential amino acids in older adults, where you're looking at about 10 to 12 grams of essential amino acids in younger adults. And again, that could be met through individual foods or a mixed meal.
One last topic I'd love for you to touch on. We've heard about the protein in dairy, but also seeing emerging research surrounding full-fat dairy products. And so I'm curious if you could address what's the most kind of top-line recent research on full-fat dairy versus lower non-fat, and is it possibly true that full-fat could be a better option than skim for nutrition or health reasons?
Sure. And before I forget, I do want to mention that actually Leslie and I recently participated in an NDC-sponsored webinar on this exact topic that folks can download and listen to from the NDC website. So I would encourage you to go check that out at your leisure, and you could actually get continuing education credits from the Academy by listening to that webinar. So that's going to do a much more in-depth response to this specific question. But in brief, I'll give you the highlights, right? And generally what we know is dairy foods collectively as a category. And when I say dairy foods, I mean the research that has looked at the gamut or included from fat-free to whole-fat dairy, as well as different dairy foods, milk, cheese, and yogurt. When you collapse that all together, the weight of the evidence generally shows that dairy foods are associated with reduced risk various chronic diseases, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and lower blood pressure in adults. Specific to whole fat dairy, whole fat or reduced fat dairy, The good news is that essentially we know that those findings are either neutral, meaning no impact, or there's been some research to actually show a similar benefit on reducing risk for those diseases. So, while more research needs to be done specifically on whole fat dairy foods, what we can say is with confidence is that there's no data that shows increased risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, blood pressure, or other issues with consumption of whole milk dairy foods. So then the question becomes, is there a recommended preference, whole milk versus skim, for example? And I think generally I would say, regardless of fat level, milk, for example, contains the same 9 essential nutrients. So you're still getting the high quality protein and the micronutrients that are provided regardless of fat level. My next kind of point of discussion would be if you're working with an individual client or athlete, it's, are they meeting current dairy recommendations that are outlined in the current dietary guidelines? And that's for, ages 9 and up to consume 3 servings of dairy a day. If you're working with an athlete that is meeting 3 servings of dairy a day and they're happy doing that with low fat and fat-free foods, I would say, it's not broken, so don't mess with it, don't try to fix it, right? Let them continue to select the foods that they enjoy. If they're having trouble meeting those 3, and as you probe, one of the reasons why they may not is that they don't like the taste of low fat or fat free. I think given the research, they should be allowed some flexibility to choose higher fat sources, assuming it's going to stay within their calorie goals, right? To get that 3 servings, and I think with confidence that it's not necessarily going to increase their risk for disease. So I think work with folks on an individual basis, get that 3. Same nutrient profile, and really personalize. I think as most folks listening here are aware, it comes down to personalizing to develop the best meal plan for who you're working with.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And I know we're going to jump to Leslie in a second, but I did want to give Abby a chance to wrap up her thoughts about antibiotics. I think the key takeaway message is there's no antibiotics in our milk.
Yeah, not quite sure where I lost you guys, but where I was kind of going with that is, as a dietitian and a farmer, I can confidently make that statement because we work with our veterinarian along with the FDA and the farm program to not only make sure that we're following the regulations appropriately to make sure that that does not happen, but also that we're responsibly using antibiotics. So if one of our ladies does fall sick, and we know that antibiotics can help her jump back quicker, feel better quicker, we make sure that we're following those protocols so that that milk gets discarded until she's able to return back with her normal herd mates and is able to then have milk that's antibiotic free and can then be sold in for human consumption.
Awesome. Great. And then I know another really I'm getting a little echo. Sorry about that. I know we also get a lot of questions about hormones. And so I'm wondering if, I see hormone-free all the time on pack. And I just hoping maybe you could speak to the topic of hormones, explain maybe the difference between milks labeled hormone-free versus not. Are hormones even in milk? Just if you could touch on that briefly.
Yes, 100%. So I'll try to skim through this because I always love hearing Leslie, so I want to make sure she has enough time. So when it comes to a lot of times when people refer to hormone or have concerns about hormones in milk, a lot of times I always like to kind of reframe the conversation just to make people think about the deeper aspect of food. A lot of people like to think about hormones when it comes to animal products, but what people have to realize is that when it comes to any type of food consumption, there's going to be a hormonal chemistry to that food, right? Because in order to reproduce food, grow food for living organisms to survive, it has to have hormones. And I don't say that so that people then continue to question all their food, but I say that because people need to realize that that is a normal chemistry of consuming plants and animal products, and that they don't have to have a fear of it interfering with their human biological chemistry, and they can still be ensured that that nutritional value to that food is still there and still relevant for their bodies. So when it comes to dairy food specifically, a lot of times what people refer to when they think of the labeling, hormone-free milk, et cetera, it's usually that BST that they're referring to. And That's just an acronym for a fancy word, bovine somatotropin. And it's actually naturally produced by the animal. It has to do with their negative and positive energy balance and how that's corrected. And it actually was the synthetic form that was a tool farmers were using was actually created back in the 80s. And the FDA was allowing it as a management tool on farms because it actually, chemistry, there's no difference between the natural form and the synthetic form. And the FDA did research to look at the impact on human consumption. And of course, there was no findings that it inhibited human consumption or the nutrition of milk in any way. And humans really just digest it like they do any other protein, starting in their stomach, eventually just absorbing it as amino acids. So what really drove it out of the market was consumers. At the end of the day, as farmers, we're selling a product. So if consumers are pushing for a certain way of production, we have to eventually listen to them. So really what we were using it for on the farm is to be able to help our ladies transition into milk production after they had a calf. Some of them have a little bit of trouble going from getting back into that positive energy balance to then get comfortably transitioned into milk production. So we're using it through their transitional period to be able to help them with that. But I could say about now, 98 to 99% of the US milk production actually does not even use that. Unfortunately, our processors actually can't even test for it because VST occurs naturally in the milk. So if you were going to test for it, it would still test positive. So it's really just a pledge that our farmers have taken saying, we recognize that it is a safe tool to use on farms, but because our consumers have spoke loudly enough, we will stop using it because we do respect our consumers. And as we go forward from that experience, we've learned that education for our consumers so they understand the tools that we're using is very, very important. So really with the marketing, if you go out and buy milk that says hormone-free or antibiotic-free, it's really misleading for our consumers because they can pretty much buy any product out there, and I can 100% guarantee you there's no antibiotics in it, and about 99% of our farmers aren't using the synthetic form of what they refer to as the hormones in milk, and they still don't have to be worried because it doesn't affect them biologically by consuming it anyways. They still get those great 9 essential nutrients from milk.
Awesome. One last question for you before we switch over to Leslie. Okay. We have gotten a lot of questions touching on the environment, and I'm just wondering if you can discuss a little bit about the gas emissions and from cows.
Yeah, for sure. So when we look at agriculture, I always like to joke that cows were green before it was even cool, because our ladies not only biologically are designed to upcycle a lot of waste products that we have, but we in the dairy industry have also been looking at our carbon footprint since the 40s. And because we've been doing that, we actually have been able to show that using the same unit of milk production, so say we have a gallon of milk, we're actually using 90% less land to produce that gallon of milk, as well as 63 or 65% less water, reducing our carbon footprint by about 63% since the 40s. So I always like to kind of boast a little bit about that because not a lot of people can say they even know what their footprint is, let alone other industries being able to track that data for that long. And a lot of that comes from us looking at the data collect. So when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture is about 7% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and dairy industry accounts for about 2% of that, and about 5% of the water draw from in the United States is from dairy agriculture. And I always like to emphasize that that percentage is actually from field to face. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, it's super catchy and people tend to pay attention to you when you use it. And two is because I want people to realize that when we're looking at our impact on the environment, we're not just as farmers saying, oh, we're responsible for our piece. We're going to let the processors think about their piece and let consumers think about their piece. As dairy farmers and as an industry, we recognize the nutritional relevance of our products. So we take the environmental impact very seriously to make sure as we go forward that we're able to give consumers access to that nutrition as our population grows. So when we say field to face, we're thinking about our CO2, methane, and nitrogen contribution to greenhouse gases from the moment we're fitting a field to grow crops for our ladies, all the way to you putting it in your mouth. So we're even thinking about the food waste that goes on in your house when we think about the environmental impact. So on farm, the way we really measure those is, again, we utilize programs like the farm program, as well as the Innovation Center, to really, as an industry, report data on manure production, the size of our farm, application rates on our field, to not only use information back and forth to say, hey, these people are using this practice, we could probably implement this and do a little bit better, but also measure things collectively as a whole on farm, at the processing plant, at the grocery store, to try to do better all the way across the food chain. So on the farm, when we look at our three biggest contributors, it really comes from fuel and electricity, enteric fermentation, and manure management. So a lot of our resources and reporting and practices that we put in on our farm are focusing on reducing those three major areas. And like three major gas emissions that we look at on farm is our CO2, which is the largest usually for anybody, whether you're talking dairy or manufacturing or even at home. And then second is methane, and then nitrogen as well. So those are all things we're always trying to do better at, because usually, in addition to improving the environmental impact, it also usually has a cost savings for us in dairy as well. So it's a double positive.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go over to Leslie. One of the top questions we got was related to lactose intolerance. So they would love for you to address what is lactose-free milk. I see athletes avoiding dairy because of lactose, using almond milk or something nowhere near nutritionally close to cow's milk. So can you address lactose-free and lactose intolerance a little bit?
Absolutely. And let me just start by saying that when we think about our athletes, no matter what sport that they're in, and I work in football, is the athletes basically have an agenda of three things. Number one, it has to be optimal taste. Number two, it has to be the maximum amount of haste because nobody has any time. And then they also want to have minimal waste. And so when we think about those things, also given the calorie cap and the salary cap that everybody has, let's take a look at what happens with when people are avoiding lactose. And we know sometimes it's the power of suggestion. It isn't always because they have definitive lactose intolerance. I work with a lot of athletes who've never even had the test done to determine whether or not they have it. Well, my third cousin did, therefore I can't. And so the biggest concern with this is what people eliminate from the diet. So if somebody says, I'm going to take the dairy foods out of my diet, what they choose to replace it with may not be comparable in terms of the nutritional value, which ultimately may impact that athlete's ability to perform at his or her best. And price-wise, it also might be a very big issue. And for athletes that have a minimal amount of money to spend, this is problematic. So if somebody has a reason to watch the lactose, rather than saying, I am not going to have any, there's a couple of things they can do. Number one is try a smaller amount. You do not have to have a milkshake the size of your thigh. That might be the first thing to try. So this whole idea of sipping, trying small amounts, or slicing, doing a slice of cheese, or shredding something, or even mixing a food that has lactose in it with something else may indeed help to minimize the likelihood that there may be some digestive issues. And that's the other thing that people don't always realize is not everybody has digestive issues related to consuming lactose. So we need to think about that. If somebody says, all right, I don't want to consume lactose-containing foods, what could they do instead? Well, we can buy those foods that have already been treated, such as the lactose-free milk on the marketplace. There's even a lactose-free cottage cheese on the marketplace. So that is an option. Or somebody can buy the drops and treat the milk themselves, or they can consume the pills. And what I always point out to my athletes is, if you eat the food and then you take the pills after, it doesn't work that way. You really have to think about what you're doing and strategize appropriately to get the maximum benefit. Now, the other side of that is, what if somebody says, I'm just going to take it out altogether? We know there's a lot of things competing for space and stomach share. And so all the things out there that are listed as the milk alternates, do they stack up? Nutritionally, they don't. We're talking 9 essential nutrients in milk, We cannot say that about many of the other products that are out there in that space. In addition, the cost may be more, the protein may be less, it could be problematic all the way around. So I am a very big believer in the bite by bite or sip by sip approach, and I really do encourage my athletes, unless there is a medical reason that they cannot, and in that case, they have the option of using lactase pills or even doing the lactase-treated milk. Or we also need to make sure for some athletes that it's not a milk allergy, because honestly, they don't always know. So clarifying that difference is critically important.
Thanks, Leslie, for clearing that up. One other myth we hear frequently, and you may have your athlete says that it's not lactose, it's just dairy's bad for you, or dairy has negative health effects. How do you address that with athletes?
Well, again, first of all, we're looking for what tastes good, what's quick to prepare, what could I just grab as easily as I can and not have to spend a fortune on. So that always drives the conversation. Secondly, you just heard from Matt talking about dairy fat, and indeed, some of the interesting and emerging research in that area. And I would add to what he said is I've got a lot of athletes that need to gain weight and they don't have unlimited stomach volume. So the fat in those dairy foods can be a way of getting them to the calories that they need to be achieving each and every day. We heard from Abby talking about the hormones. All athletes talk about this all the time. It's like argument, I want to take something to help me build my muscles. Hello, that's illegal. And so we really need to put this all into perspective of truly what is safe. And then we hear about athletes talking about sugar. And when we talk about that, and I know all of us have different views of this, the concern truly is around the added sugar. And I will tell you, I have a hell of a lot more concern about the sweet tea and the fact that, what it's even doing with the amount of sugar there than what potentially would be in a dairy food. It is the lactose in the food naturally, not anything added to it. And back to the 9 essential nutrients and back to the shortfall nutrients and all the things that athletes aren't getting. Macros, micros, the hydros in the dairy food, and even the microbes. What supports a healthy, fit microbiome? Well, we know that dairy foods have a role to play there positively.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, we know outside the NFL, most of our college athletes are on pretty limited budgets, so they may not be able to afford the latest, greatest supplement or powder on the market. So can you speak to some food recommendations, specifically maybe how you would incorporate powdered milk to add calories or protein to the athlete's diet?
Absolutely, and because I'm older than everybody else on this panel, I've been doing this for a really long time, powdered milk has been around for quite a while, and it's such an easy add-in into an energy bite, into a hot cocoa, even mixed into a mac and cheese and into an oatmeal at a relatively low price point. So it works very, very well, not only to add some additional protein, but additional calcium, additional carbohydrate, and additional calories in a shelf-stable form, which is, and I've seen athletes do lots of things. It's like, oh, good Lord, you can't keep that food on your air conditioner vent. That doesn't work. But because the non-fat dry milk powder is shelf stable, that can be easy, that can be portable. Somebody can take them with it and add it in many, many different ways. It can even go into a sauce because it doesn't have a sweet flavor to it. So that is one that I think is incredibly, incredibly versatile.
Awesome. And one last question before we turn it over to Katie to see what questions might have been sparked during the conversation here. Can you just speak to raw milk? Could a person switch to unpasteurized milk without experiencing stomach issues? What are your thoughts?
One of the things we always talk about with our athletes is their safety. And that is not just wearing helmets, pads, or any other protective equipment. It's the safety inside. And, you can be a risk taker to a certain extent, and there are certain things that really, why would you want to mess with? The problem with raw milk is the presence of bacteria that indeed may be harmful, and that is why the milk is pasteurized, to keep it safe, so there isn't a question about consuming bacteria that you do not want to be consuming. Even though it sounds quite trendy, there's a lot of other things like trendy, like eating poisonous mushrooms, and that could kill you. Why would we want to take that chance? It is better to be safe, so that indeed you are decreasing the risk of having any kind of bacterial contamination or something that might sideline you because your gut is in an uproar and then you can't perform. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, so is Katie still on? I think we may have gotten maybe a couple questions during this time.
We did actually. The first one coming in is talking about the popularity of A2 milk and just asking about the differences in digestion and if maybe Matt and Leslie could speak to that, and Abby, of course, if you have anything to add.
Sorry, I just had to take my cam off mute. So I'll start, and then obviously others feel free to jump in if that's okay with you guys. So as I mentioned, whey and casein are the two primary proteins in milk. Actually, there are various subcategories of proteins under the umbrella of whey and casein. Now, in respect to casein, one of the primary subgroups is beta casein, and there's actually two forms of that, A1 beta casein and A2 beta casein. So generally, the milk in your refrigerator right now has about a 50-50 ratio of the A1 and A2 beta caseins. So A2 milk essentially is milk that has the A1 beta casein removed. And the hypothesis from producers of A2 milk is that at least one of the potential causes of some of the digestive issues or digestive discomfort that folks may have when consuming milk, particularly, is really, it's not necessarily a lactose issue, it's an A1 beta casein issue. So, one thing to note with that, A2 milk does contain lactose. So if you do have an intolerance to lactose, your better choice are the lactose-free products that Leslie mentioned. If you try lactose-free products as a first step and you still feel like, or an athlete you're working with feels like they have some digestive issues, A2 milk might be an option to try. Because maybe it's that casein, particular form of casein that they're having some type of intolerance to. From the science on this product, I will say, in our perspective, in looking at the science, we think the science is still somewhat preliminary and has yet to conclusively prove out that hypothesis. There's been 3 clinical studies published with humans that the results have generally been mixed regarding whether claims around potential benefits of being anti-inflammatory and or digestive issues. So net, I think the jury's still out from a scientific perspective. However, I will say that A2 milk does contain the same 9 essential nutrients as regular milk. If by personal choice, again, I would go to the lactose-free milk first. If someone is still having some trouble, they may want to try the A2 milk and see how they tolerate it.
And Matt, I would just add on to that even if we're looking at whether it's a lactose-free milk, a lactase-treated milk, and an A2 milk, still any of those nutritionally are going to be far better than any of the other plant-based alternatives on the marketplace. So if A2 milk sounds cool to somebody to give it a try, and indeed they do try it, and they notice that they feel better as a result, they're going to pay a little bit more for it, but it's going to give better on the return of investment in terms of the nutrients that are in there.
Wonderful. And then the other one is just asking about the fermented dairy, like drinkable yogurts. And Leslie, if you're using those with any of your athletes and kind of how you're incorporating them into your work.
Yeah, so looking at something like kefir, most of my athletes are like, oh no, hell no. It's just not something that is familiar to them. They don't necessarily like the sourness that way. Do we use yogurt? We use it a lot. There are a few of my athletes who grab a yogurt and go because that's a convenient form. More likely, they'll use the yogurt and put it into the smoothies. And, I'm fine with that because nutritionally, that's adding a lot more than ice cream does when they do it that way. And so they're still getting the benefits of the probiotics that are in it, but it's just their preference. Now, interestingly, they all gravitate towards kombucha. So I have to find a way to make the kefir tap a little bit cooler and put that into training camp this year. Nobody heard that because that's going to be certainly special for the chief, and see how we do with that. And maybe, we just have to jazz it up, or kefir shots or something like that. That might be something that they can wrap their heads around.
I love that. And then the probably last one we have time for today is Abby. Just some questions about the hours that farmers work, and if you all get to take, have a Christmas break or anything. Could you expand upon how you manage those things?
So you definitely don't go into farming for the money. You'll never hear farmers say, well, I don't really like cows, but I know it's a lucrative business. So really you have to have a passion for it and a drive, because there's not a lot of margin in it. So really the cows become like your family. So you do certainly work holidays and weekends. One of actually the benefits of farms increasing in size across the United States is it does allow for the same continuous high quality care for the animals, but it also incorporates some better downtime for the farmers, because if you have employees or if you have multiple families involved, you're able to switch around and take some time off. But some of my fondest memories growing up was doing Christmas on the farm. We'd always wear our Santa hats, and my mom would always make food for us to take into the farm. So I definitely still enjoy seeing my ladies on the holidays. I feel like something's not quite right if we don't get to sneak in there and get a selfie with the calf with her reindeer ears on, or we would always leave hay out for Santa's reindeers down out by the calf barn. So it's definitely a way of life. It's not I don't see it as an occupation. It's more of a way of life because it sneaks into everywhere. We even have cows in our wedding photos, so we don't leave them out of anything. But definitely you have to be passionate and you have to love what you do to be in it for the long haul, because there's definitely a lot of ups and downs, and a very large commitment as far as time, finance, and even emotionally as well.
I love that. All right, Allison, let's turn it over to you for discussion about some resources.
I'm talking and I'm muted. I'm so sorry about that. So I just wanted to remind everyone that in addition to our work at the national level with CPSDA, we do have a large network of state and regional dairy councils across the U.S. To support RDs in their region. So there's actually 16 local offices, and on your handout's a map of kind of where all those offices are. If you're ever interested in connecting with your local contact or potentially coordinating event donation, sharing local resources, you can really just reach out to me directly. It's just my name, allison.koch@dairy.org. I also, before I want to highlight two things that were kind of touched on. Our webinar series, which launched earlier this year. So there's 2 recorded webinars that you can actually receive continuing education credit on, and we have 2 more coming up. I think we just discussed potentially the next one being on fermented dairy, so that's a great topic that came up today. The best way to find out about those is to sign up for our Dairy Nourishes Network, which is essentially a quarterly newsletter, but you will get notifications about events and webinars, leadership spotlights, all types of things. And this is just a quarterly update that comes out, and we encourage you to sign up for that. It will have information about anything we're doing at FNCE or other conferences that we'll be at. And so to sign up for that, it's nationaldairycouncil.org/Dairy Nourishes Network, all no spaces, all one word, and you can find that on our website. And so I mentioned the webinar series. The last thing I wanted to highlight, I've included a lot of links to different resources and tools, including the CPSDA rolling slideshow we developed with you all a few years ago. But in addition, you can find us on social, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Our hashtags are #DairyGood, #DairyNourishes and #UndeniablyDairy. And just make sure to check out that resource, that tool. A lot of great links to our science summaries. And then the other item, I think last year when we did this, I talked about we were developing some alternative beverage flashcards. So these are just great teaching resources and tools that compare milk to some of the alternative beverages that are out there. So if you are doing any education with your athletes, it might be a good resource or tool. We do have a few hard copies too, so if people want those, they can also reach out to me as well for that. And I just want to thank our speakers especially, and as well as Katie for her moderating, and Amy for all of her behind-the-scenes coordination today. And with that, I'm just going to kick it back to Katie to close us out with 1 minute to spare.
And then
You're muted.
All right, that's all the time we have. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you found the information very useful. We will be posting a recording of this webinar to our resource webinar library at sportsrd.org. So thank you all so much and have a great day.